And then you can, okay,
Get it set up from here.
all righty. Well, good afternoon. And on behalf of our president, Jim Van Voorst, who can't be with us today, I welcome you all to the Emeritus Center's fourth presentation of the fall. We're halfway through the program calendar and sliding ever closer to the impending 2024 presidential election. I didn't know how many people we would have here today. And I said, I'm Scott Burge, and you know who I am, and blah, blah, blah. And today's conversation is entitled Identity and the 2024 Presidential Election. And I'm really pleased to have two of our UAlbany's noted assistant professors who have studied several salient areas of focus for consideration during the next few weeks and throughout the entire election process. Cammie Jo Boland is an assistant professor of political science at the University of Albany. Her research interests include identity, participation. I've read this over, honest.
It's okay.
Participation and women's leadership in political and religious contexts in the United States. She's the co-author of the She Preached the Word, Women's Ordination in Modern America, and that was with Benjamin Knoll in 2018. In her current book project, she examines how women's candidates' self-presentation strategies have evolved in recent congressional elections, and she evaluates how constituents respond to these decisions. She holds a PhD in American government from George Washington University and a BA in politics and history from Centre College. I used to be a DJ in college. I used to say, I just washed my mouth and I can't do a thing with it. Justin Zimmerman is an assistant professor of American politics at UAlbany. His area of concentration is Black politics and urban politics. His research aims to understand how Black Chicagoans work with institutions and neighbors they distrust to pursue common policy goals. In this case, to remedy state and community violence. His research on distrust and coalition building is forthcoming in Politics, Groups, and Identities. And his current book project will consider the coalitions and compromises made by Black Chicagoans when they work with distrusted institutions. Justin received his PhD from Northwestern University in 2023. He also is a proud alum of the University of Alabama, Roll Tide.
I was proud of it before Saturday.
Where we no longer speak about football. And he received a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science and Philosophy in 2009 and a Master of Public Administration with a concentration in Organizational Management in 2011. Prior to pursuing a career in academia, Justin resided in Washington, D.C., where he supported the Department of Treasury as an acquisition consultant with Octo Consulting Group and served in multiple roles with the Department of State. Let's begin by welcoming Justin and Cammie. And Cammie will, she wonderful going to us, and she will begin the conversation. Cammie. You jump over the.
That's okay. Yeah, that's the hardest hurdle. All right. Thank you all for joining us today. And if anyone's on Zoom, thank you all as well. So I will start out by talking about gender and the current election, focusing on the presidency, and then I'll turn it over to Justin and he will talk about race. So we'll divide it that way. All right. So I'll kind of divide this into good news and bad news for the Kamala Harris campaign. One area of good news is that most of the gender-based disadvantages occur in the earlier stages of women's candidacies. So we know that there are differences that begin in early childhood where girls at a very young age are socialized to think about politics as a boy's or a man's world. These differences continue as girls and boys age, and we begin to see differences in political interest, where again, from a young age, boys become more interested in politics. are more likely to be asked, have you considered running for office? This continues into college, and then when we look at people who are in careers that typically feed into politics, so business and law and to some extent higher education, we again see that men in these careers are more likely to have considered running for office than women. So turning back to Kamala Harris, she has passed those stages. She is in the general election. She is running for office. However, there are still a number of factors that women and men candidates have to deal with when they are planning their strategies of their messaging, how to present themselves, how to talk to voters, how to try to convince people that you should support me. And most of these considerations are more difficult for women candidates than they are for men. So for qualifications, there's political science research that shows that voters overall hold women candidates to higher standards of qualifications than men. So looking at professional background, years in politics, education, there's an uneven playing field there. There's also a lot of research looking at stereotypes. Stereotypes related to traits and policy issues and gender and leadership. And this is something else that women candidates have to consider and think about when they're planning their strategies. So for traits, a lot of the traits that people associate with good leaders are also more masculine traits. So assertiveness or strength are things that people want in their politician, especially at the level of the presidency, these executive positions, but they're also traits where men candidates have an advantage over women. There are also some differences when it comes to policy issues. There are certain policy issues that voters overall tend to think that men are better at. I'll focus on one of those in a bit and associate it to the current election. But the economy, what I'll talk about in a bit, is something that is this masculine-owned issue, that voters overall are more likely to think that candidates who are men are better prepared to lead on this issue. Topics like healthcare and education and abortion are issues that tend to be seen as strengths of women candidates. So abortion is an area where Kamala Harris has an advantage, and the economy is an area where Donald Trump has an advantage. You can see that a bit here in this polling looking at which candidate registered voters are more confident that they can make good decisions about economic policy. So this was Pew Research Center, and they asked registered voters this in July before Joe Biden decided not to run, and then September when Kamala Harris was the candidate. So you can see that voters actually give a slight advantage to Kamala Harris over their perceptions of Joe Biden in the economy, but Trump still has a clear advantage in this area, where a majority of Americans think Trump is better prepared to make good decisions about the economic policy in comparison to Kamala Harris. So I think this is one policy area that is a strong disadvantage for Kamala Harris and her campaign. It's an area where men overall are seen to have an advantage. It's also an issue area where a majority of voters say, this is the most important policy area for me when I'm voting this election. It's also something where the incumbent party gets either rewarded or punished at the level of the presidency. And right now, I think despite a lot of economists' assessments of the economy, people don't think or perceive that their economic conditions are improving. Because of that, I think this is an area that will benefit the Republicans over the Democrats. All right. I'll talk a little bit about gender and vote choice and what we know. The first point to emphasize is that partisanship matters most. People are considerably more likely to vote based on whether they are a Democrat or a Republican than based on the gender or the race of a candidate. However, gender and race are still important, and I'll talk about that in a bit. One of the things for political science research that came out of Donald Trump's victory in 2016 is a lot of new research questions and a changing research agenda. And like we saw with journalists, we saw with political pundits, political scientists were also trying to figure out what happened in 2016. Why did Donald Trump win when most of us, probably Trump included, thought that Hillary Clinton would be victorious? And some of this research finds that attitudes about women was a significant predictor of how people voted in 2016. So there are various measures of sexism that are asked to people in surveys, and people who were higher on scales of sexism were also more likely to support Donald Trump in 2016. So that was an independent predictor, even when considering partisanship. So for a portion of the American public, a small portion, but we know that these elections are close, so things on the margins can make a difference, that these attitudes about women and their role in society can affect how people vote. So that's something that we will see many months from now when research begins on this current election. Something else to come out of 2016 is looking at this idea of a gender gap and how women versus men vote in presidential elections. So a lot of the discussion leading up to the 2016 election was looking at, or for many, hoping that there would be this rush of women from both parties to support Hillary Clinton, that it was a historic nomination. Maybe some or many Republican women would move to the Democratic Party. But that was not the case, as we know. The gender gap in 2016 in voting was the highest in history. There was a bigger difference between women and men in their support for the Democrats. But we also know that this gender gap was the most significant difference was between Black women who were voting overwhelmingly for Hillary Clinton and white men who have moved more and more to the Republican Party. So I think in this current election, where race is even more salient than it was in 2016, I would imagine that this gender and race gap will be even more pronounced, looking at how certain segments of voters, who they choose to support in 2024. I have another graph for you, this time from I believe the Kaiser Family Foundation. So this was a survey that they did just focused on women voters. So they did the survey in June of 2024, and then again after Kamala Harris entered the race in September of 2024. And in this report, they asked a ton of different questions, measuring people's excitement and voting intention and different measures of political participation. But what I have here is asking people if they are satisfied with the choices they have in the 2024 election. And what I want to highlight is among women voters overall, there was a big jump in satisfaction about the candidates once Kamala Harris entered the race. You can see here overall, there was this jump from 40% of women who were satisfied to 64% of women voters who were satisfied. However, again, complicating this narrative, if we look at Republican women down here, there was essentially no change in their excitement or their satisfaction in the race when Joe Biden was the Democratic nominee versus Kamala Harris. So again, I think this is further evidence that we can't expect this big swell of support from Republican women, even though, again, it's a chance to elect the first woman president. All right. One more thing I wanted to highlight, and then I'll turn it over to Justin here. Something that I think is particularly interesting and something I'll be watching in this election is looking at our youngest voters and this trend where young women in particular are becoming more and more liberal, outpacing women of older generations, Whereas young men, so this is looking at the political ideology of those age 18 to 29, but however you cut this age cohort, young men are not following suit. Young men are either by some major measures becoming a lot more conservative and by others staying about the same, but they're not following women in their increase in becoming more ideologically liberal and more supportive of the Democratic Party. What's even more interesting to me is that among young women, this trend towards supporting Democrats is also coupled with a trend of being considerably more interested and active in politics than young men. So there's been this gender gap in rates of voting for generations where women are more likely to vote than men. It varies from like 2 percentage points to around 10, but it's a consistent finding. However, in every other measure of political participation, men outpace women. So in donations, in discussing politics, in volunteering for campaigns, knocking on doors, in all of those areas, men are more likely to be politically active. However, this is reversing for our youngest voters. Whereas young men aged 18 to 29 are becoming less interested in politics overall, where young women are more engaged, more active, even when looking at donations or volunteering or knocking on doors. So this is something to watch and something I think could matter in this election, is looking at if we'd see a big increase among young women in their turnout and to see the extent to which young men follow suit and how they vote, if they go more for Trump or for Harris. So I'm happy to talk about any of this at the end, but I'll turn it over for now.
Thank you, Cammie.
Yeah.
So one of the big questions of the election is have Black constituents now gone a lurch towards the right wing? Are they more likely to vote for Trump? Particularly Black men, kind of on the same wavelength of what you're talking about, what Professor Boland was talking about, and and men in general coming at least statically in their same ideology or becoming more right wing. So I think a history lesson is due in order to understand exactly Black people's relationship to the two-party system and how it relates to the presidential candidacy and elections. So one of the big things that, why everyone's kind of freaking out about this is that, Black people have been steadfast Democrats, as Ishmael White and Cheryl Laird say. You look through basically since the Voting Rights Act of 1965, Black women, 95% clip when it comes to voting for Democrats in the presidential election. Black men not following far behind, between 90, 80. So, we're pretty Democratic in general, Black people. But that doesn't mean that this has gone without any type of concern for what the Democratic Party can bring to Black people with regards to tangible material benefits and rights. And this, I think it's fair to say, a wish that there was more selection, both in the Democratic Party and with other parties, in thinking about what policy can look like and what political representation can look like. So I start with this: the two-party system versus the no-party system. It's part of a textbook that I assigned that Walter Smith and Wallace wrote, old school Black political scientists, that really kind of nails down the complications that Black people have had with the two-party system ever since we gained the right to vote. Gained the right to vote twice. Once with those Reconstruction amendments, the 13th, 14th, and of course the 15th Amendment that allowed Black men to vote. And again, for the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that allowed everybody else to vote. So it starts with 3 time periods to think about. 1868 to 1936, the one-party system. which, if you all remember, the Republican Party starts off as an abolitionist party for the most part, right? It starts off as a party that introduces those 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments and gets them through the door. It's the reason why they call themselves the Party of Lincoln, ironically. Really leaning into freedom and what they used to do to actually push a more democratic system. And it did happen with the Republican Party. And within this party, you see all the gains of Reconstruction. You see more Black men in the South, gaining more, obviously gaining any type of elected official positions, voting. But what happens in the middle of this, at the very tail end of this one-party system? You get the 1877 Great Compromise. Have you guys heard the Great Compromise before? And part of that Great Compromise was what? Getting rid of the federal troops that were enforcing those Reconstruction amendments and new rights.
He won the vote.
Yeah, exactly.
Like the electoral system stole from him.
No, gave it to Rutherford B. Hayes. Yes, exactly. Very, very good. And this obviously becomes a great shift, right? Because you see the evolution of the Jim Crow laws and everything that takes away the political system, the political rights of people, Black people, particularly in the South. And eventually you start seeing at least some limited party competition when you get to 1936. What do you all think about from 1936? Like, what was the great event that happened then? The Great Depression. Yeah, yeah, a little bit further, like Great Depression and the New Deal, to be more exact. That's what I'm trying to go to. And you start seeing kind of this New Deal coalition that emerges, that allows for Black people to still vote Republican, but also lean more towards Democrats, especially Franklin Roosevelt Democrats, that are at least giving them some amount of welfare benefits, though uneven because racism. But you see at least some limited forms of a two-party system, particularly in the North, because obviously in the South there's still Jim Crow. And then we return to the one-party system after 1964, which is quizzical, right? Because in 1965 and 1964, we know the Civil Rights Act of 1964 gets passed. We know that the Voting Rights Act of 1965 gets passed. So certainly that should mean that Black people are getting a more democratic system, right? But not quite, because we start with the beginnings of what we're seeing now, right? More and more polarization, more and more racial polarization of where people are going to be able to vote. We see white people, with regards to the Southern strategy, moving further and further into Dixiecrat land, and then eventually Republicans. And we see Black folks starting to vote more solidly into the Democratic Party. So it becomes this one-party system. And there's a quote by Frederick Douglass. It starts, obviously, different time. He says, the Republican Party is the deck, all else is the sea. Starting there, when Black folks first get the political right, meaning basically there is nobody else to vote for. And then by the time you get to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, obviously he's not alive, but basically the Democratic Party is the deck, all else is the sea. So it becomes a really limited version of what Black politics can look like, what Black political behavior can look like when you have one party who is antagonistic to your rights and one party that, they may do some things, but maybe not enough. And this is where the term captured group comes from. It was coined by Paul Freimer, and it's basically a way of thinking about how modern day, and it still applies today, coined in 1999, but it still applies to 2024. Black Americans are captured into this two-party system that really limits what they're able to do with their vote and what they're able to accomplish with policy. And particularly, the two-party system marginalizes Black interests because it doesn't allow, the basics of understanding political science, right? It moderates. But when you're looking for freedom, that typically radicalizes, right? When you're looking for certain rights. But in the two-party system, there's a lot of moderation. So Democrats are insufficiently able to meet the needs of the greater Black population, while Republicans are outwardly hostile and antagonistic to it oftentimes, which puts the greater Black American community in a really tough spot where you want more options. There may be, and that even there are Black people. I think there's been an estimate that a third of Black folks actually identify as conservative, but still won't pull the trigger with Republicans because of the hostility. So there really is a need for more diversity in thinking about all of this. But where do you go when there's only one party that's willing to negotiate, willing to think through what you need as a citizen, willing to consider you a citizen? Where do you go? So, this kind of talks about distrust. And this is stuff that I do. And I do more local politics type of things and policing type of things, but I think it still relates to like the presidential election. So that's why I bring it up. So I start off when I do my research by like thinking about distrust and how that forms and how people think about Black Chicagoans think about the institutions that they interact with. In this case, nonprofits, local politicians, police, and stuff like that. Neighbors. And how I define distrust is through the harm that's been caused, through the community conversations that they've had about who they can trust and who they can't trust, or who's been socialized into it. And basically what their experiences have been with these institutions. Same thing applies with the presidency, right? So it's like there are two options, there are several options, but they essentially mold into one option. You can decide to completely bypass the institution and move on with whatever you're trying to do with your life and ignore politics and isolate and find other ways to meet your needs, the cynicism part. Or she gives these 4 options, but you can basically find a way to cooperate. And this is the pickle that we're seeing with regards to Black politics and thinking about presidential elections. What are they going to do? Are they going to go ahead and support Kamala Harris, who will be the first Black woman president? So descriptive representation matters. I guess I should have made a slide about that too. It matters, but to an extent, as Cammie brought up, artisanship matters too. So, they can do that, or they can choose to stay home. And it really kind of depends, because even within all of this talk of, history and, the first Black woman president, she's still a prosecutor. The policing cynicism part of what I do. She still has perspectives on state violence that a lot of younger Black people do not agree with. Kamala Harris still has to win over some people who are essentially exhausted by the two-party system and what it has not accomplished for Black interest. But hence why, last week, what did she come up with? The Black agenda for Black men, right? Like, what are we gonna do? Cryptocurrency. Okay. All right. So these are real issues, and these are some of the real discussions that have to be made. Now, do I think most Black men are gonna bump their head and vote for Trump? No. But I do think there is a real problem of them not showing up, of Black people not showing up, of Black people becoming exhausted with the political system and the decisions that it gives them. So that will be for both candidates, one more earnest than others, that will be the challenge. Why should I be bothered? Trump will say, what the hell do you have to lose? But historically, quite a bit. So that's what I'll stop.
What are therapeutic consequences?
Questions? Oh, yes. Oh, we can talk about this too. Okay. So this was Monica Bell's a sociologist. So I'm part political scientist and kind of a sociologist a little bit. So I fit perfectly with Rockefeller. But basically what she was looking at was poor Black mothers in Washington, D.C. and how they interacted with the police. And she found that there were certain ways that they could interact with the police depending on their level of distrust. So they can do the cynicism route, but they just completely ignore them. They don't want to be bothered with them. They don't want to do anything with them, and they'll find another solution to whatever their problem is. Or they can do institutional navigation, which is basically using the police to figure something out. She uses the example of the one Black mother needed a way of figuring out how to navigate public housing. So she used a police officer to do so. Or they can use officer exceptionalism, or just exceptionalism in general, where it's like, I don't trust the institution, but I trust them. That individual person is pretty cool, and I can use them for whatever I need to get done. Or domain specificity is where things have gotten out of hand and I have nowhere else to go but to call them, the police. And therapeutic consequences is similar to domain specificity, which is basically the idea that someone in the family has had a mental breakdown and they call the police to help, which we all know is an extremely dangerous thing to do because police don't handle Black men with, with mental illnesses very well. But it's something that happens a lot, dealing with therapeutic consequences and deciding whether or not you're going to go ahead and cooperate with them to try to remedy the consequence. Now, how I use this in my research is I spend less time on these specific instances and more time understanding the consequences of such instances of using some form of situational trust. So I ask questions like, okay, we've established whether or not you've distrusted them and why you distrust them. So when you talk to these particular police or local politicians, what are you able to achieve and what are you able to gain from them? And at the same time, what do you lose? So in the context of when I talk about state and community violence, often they're able to get some form of remedy and some form of discussion about what to do about community violence, which is just violence between community members and neighbors. But when they start talking about the things that the police are doing to them, that's when situations get shut down unless it's talked about, and they kind of have to decide, well, do I at least get a solution to the community violence, though they're still not going to do anything about the abuses that they're causing to us? So those are the weird, well, not so much weird, but the complex realities that they have to work through. And with this, because I talk a lot about class too, how people deal with institutions they distrust varies by class. So people who are upper middle class, or people like me, the professor, navigate distrusted institutions differently because they have more of a repertoire of how to deal with them. While folks who are impoverished often have to decide whether to fully isolate, kind of like what I was talking about in general. When do you decide just to fully politically, socially isolate and let whatever be? Well, I went a little ways all over the place. So questions?
I was just thinking about early years of the Obama presidency. And I think there might be a parallel to some of the paradoxes that Black people confront with the nature of our political system. As I recall, Obama started out, what I was most frustrated about with him early in his presidency was he would start out to try to bargain with the Republicans, and he'd go halfway and expect them to come halfway too. But they didn't come at all. And so what you're confronting then is you've got one side which is willing to negotiate and willing to try to make some kind of progress, although you know it's never going to be all the progress you need, and the other side that is completely resistant to any change whatsoever, and it ends up kind of moving things slowly more and more to the recalcitrant position that they won't move at all.
It's funny you bring that up because one of my committee members, her name is Sally Newman. She does great work on Black women in politics. And she coined the term collective participatory debt. And it's similar to what you talk about, because sometimes, all the time, Democrats often forget who got them there. So they'll focus a lot on trying to negotiate with conservatives that typically don't vote for them, but forget about the Black women in particular who have gotten them to that level. And what Sally Newman argues, and then she doesn't just argue this from a national level, but from a local level, eventually Black women get tired. They no longer want to participate in the democratic system because they put in all this effort to try to get some change. In her book, she talks a lot about school closures in Philadelphia and Chicago. And for what? Nothing has changed, or it's changed so incrementally that it's almost nothing compared to the effort they put into it, which really calls into question, how long can we just rely on people to an extent, have faith in democracy, even when they're not seeing enough change for all the effort that they're putting in?
It also relates to some of my discussion about stereotypes that women and Black women in particular face. So your discussion about Obama makes me think of Kamala Harris and her promise to put a Republican on their cabinet.
Yes.
But I think she feels she has to do that because women and Black women in particular are perceived as being more liberal, even when in many cases they are more moderate or even more conservative on some issues. So to fight that, I think part of her strategy is to try to, through this signal of putting a Republican in the cabinet or the promise to do so, at least try to make the case that, no, I'm actually appealing to moderates. And I think as Justin was saying, the risk there is that a lot of Democrats and a lot of people from these groups that you need to rely on to win, they don't want a Republican in the cabinet. And maybe a lot of at least some of the Republicans are not going to be swayed by her promise to put someone on the cabinet, in the cabinet. So I think that goes back to some of the pressures that she faces because of her identities as a woman and a Black woman and an Asian woman.
I perceive, and this could be a stereotype and I'll be corrected, I perceive Black women as a strong authority figure in the home. If boys grow up with this strong figure, why do they change as young men and all of a sudden have prejudice against a woman being a president? The woman has been the president all their growing up life. But now why aren't they going to vote for a woman?
Well, remember, historically, Black men do vote for women. Black men voted for Hillary Clinton more at a higher clip than white women did. So they do. But also, remember, Black family structures are vary, right? I grew up in a 2-parent home. I had my dad and I had my mom. They were both equal authority figures in how I grew up and thought about things. And that's not abnormal. So we have to, what I think is mostly what's happening is thinking about class differences within the Black communities and what can actually be received and what counts as progress. I talk about this a lot in my class. I talk about how sometimes, like when we think about something like after the Voting Rights Act of 1965, when we saw this influx of Black mayors, right? Who were they? What type of Black people were they able to help and actually push through the door of getting progress and what we consider progress and getting them into the middle class, right? We think about highly educated Black folks. We think about Black folks who would eventually take government jobs. But also, there were Black folks that got left behind in all of that, right? And that's what we have to think about. It's not so much, I think, though it exists, sexism exists in all races. Though that exists, it's not so much just about sexism, but it's also about who gets left behind. And how long can you keep coming to that well to ask them to vote for you, to ask them to trust you when you're not giving tangible benefits? And I think that's why Kamala gave such a specific plan for Black men to try to show that, because some of it's sexism, I'm not gonna lie, like some of that is sexism, but some of it is also a legitimate concern about, first, she is a prosecutor. And policing in Black community is a sensitive subject. But also, honestly, I can't think of too many times. I mean, Barack Obama came out with My Brother's Keeper, which was basically a mentor program. There aren't too many times where people get very specific on what they're going to do for Black people and what they're going to do for Black men. Though they're oftentimes, I don't want to say the bottom because I don't like the way that sounds. They're oftentimes extremely vulnerable to police violence, to economic precarity, and to, honestly, educational precarity. But yet no one really has a plan. And that's for Black people in general. So I understood why she felt she needed to reach them directly. Because no, her merely being a Black woman. And actually, I like that you said also an Asian woman, because that plays a role too. What is the Black consciousness of Kamala? All of that plays a role in trying to get people to trust her, Black folks to trust her. And I think that plays, in a lot of ways, that plays larger roles. Yeah. Yeah.
Do the issues that face Black voters also impact other people of color, brown people, Hispanics, Asians, are they the same issues? And since that's going to be the majority of our population, why don't we have a plan to appeal to that type of voters?
Now that is an interesting spot. So in the way that I talk about race and racism, right? I talk about how honestly, when we think about the civil rights movement, it played a very large role in making sure that there wasn't just progress for Black people, that there was progress for people of color, and that there was progress for white women, right? Because Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, Hart-Celler Act, all play a role in creating this diversity that we see today, and this improvement in, arguably, racial improvement in what we see with regards to political power for not just Black people, but for Latinx people and Asian folks. Now, does that mean they all have the same exact issues? It's complicated, right? For Latinx folks, you're going to have more of issues with regards to certain things like undocumented immigration and migration. That's not to say that doesn't affect Black people, but a lot of the Black population has been here for generations. Though it's still a problem, as we saw with Trump talking about, Haitians eating cats. So it's still there, but it's not necessarily the number one thing. You also have to think about region and where these folks are coming from. So there's a lot of Black folks that are still in the South. That is the majority of where we are. So that comes with different issues, particularly because those are typically red states that are also extremely hostile to Black rights. So you spend a lot of time, like, what did KIV do in Alabama about 8 years ago? She required the voter ID law, but she took away all the DMVs in the Black Belt. So those type of things. And those are things that are issues with Latinx people too. So there is commonality, and there is commonality even with regards to policing. But at the same time, and I think this is fair to say, there is this complexity where, what are you doing for us though? We've been here. We've been loyal to the Democratic Party. We are the most loyal group to the Democratic Party. What are you going to do for us? So there is an understanding that there may be some commonality with other groups, but also, what about us?
Right.
And there has to be an answer to it, right? Because the Black men are the highest group of people being incarcerated. But Black folks and Latinx folks are at the tail end of economic precarity. So there has to be answers to these questions, and sometimes Democrats and especially Republicans just don't have the answers.
Did you have your
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes.
Part of it was some of the things that you just said, but when you mentioned I think we're talking about the Black voters that across the country, and you mentioned that they're Black men, a lot of the votes are in the South, and the Black votes in the South that she should really care about are in Atlanta and Charlotte and Wilmington, North Carolina, and that's about it, right? I mean, because she's not going to win any votes from any of the other states,
Well, 8 years ago, you wouldn't have said she wouldn't Georgia.
Yeah.
Well, no, they say Georgia was.
But Georgia is up for grabs because Black women especially, but Black people in general, made a concentrated effort, particularly Stacey Abrams, made a concentrated effort to make it competitive.
Yes.
So when we we say that, we have to push against the idea that this state is unwinnable. It's unwinnable until somebody bothers to mobilize and put money behind it.
Yeah, but the money, I mean, it's October now. Four Octobers ago,
Oh, yeah.
people were saying, yes, this
And I
is.
think that goes to where, so in my campaigns and elections class, the framework of the textbook I use, which I really like, is thinking about both the rules that structure our elections and our broader system, and then the broader realities that also matter. So I think part of what is structuring campaign strategy and your discussion of which Black votes matter is because it's not a popular vote system. Because we have this electoral college in place, there isn't as much of an incentive for Kamala Harris to court the Black voters in Tennessee, for example, or the Black voters in Alabama. Whereas if it was a system where whoever wins the popular vote wins, then it would make sense for her to visit cities in states that she is unlikely to win, to encourage the Democrats that are in those cities and sometimes in those small towns to get them to turn out to vote. So I think that's the rules structuring our system are placing less of an incentive for her to reach out to or make campaign stops to a lot of these states. And that could be problematic in the long run for Democrats that this is different, but I come from Kentucky, and you see this with rural voters too, that rural voters feel neglected by both parties, that neither party is trying to bring them in and support them. So I think similar to some of our discussions of Black Americans, maybe it changes and affects their political trust in the long run. But I think due to the rules in place, there isn't much of an incentive for her to try to get out the vote at any large scale in just a lot of the United States.
I was relating it to what you had said also, because you mentioned that putting a Republican in the cabinet. I mean, Kennedy and Obama had Republicans in the cabinet, you know, and it doesn't really, I mean, I think to offset that, to compensate for that among this voting group is to say, well, these are the things I'm doing for the big cities in North Carolina and the big two cities, one or two cities in Georgia. And you know, that I'm surprised that would be a big issue to people. If you're saying, look, I'm doing these great things in your community, all these transportation things, you know, the minor cabinet folks that you know, powerful politicians can really make into a platform. But you know, basically those two guys put Republicans in the big, you know, in Treasury and defense. You know, but if you put somebody in transportation or, you know, urban.
I don't think that there are going to be a lot of Democrats who won't vote for her because she is going to put a Republican in the cabinet.
Won't show up.
But I also don't think it's going to convince a lot of Republicans that they should turn and support her because of this. I think it's a small part of her strategy, but not one that's
Well, it's kind of
going
like,
to make
I'll
much of
stop
a
after
difference.
this. It's kind of like what you said about, you're not gonna get these Republicans to suddenly change and vote another way, but you get Democrats to show up more, Republicans to stay home more. You know, that's a more achievable strategy.
Part of the strategy is mobilizing the people you can count on, or you assume you can count on to vote. And then another part of the strategy is trying to persuade those who are still persuadable, which isn't too many at this point.
Yes. And the only reason I had a little pushback is because I also want us to think about the fact that there's a reverse Great Migration happening. So a lot of those red states aren't going to be red for very much longer, not just Georgia.
Yeah.
And we should also think about the fact that who thought Alabama would ever have another Democratic senator? It could happen, but you have to be prepared for it to happen. And you have to be prepared to strategic. Who's Trump?
Yeah.
Trump. I mean, he's not that far off of that. So that's partly what I'm talking about. There has to be preparation. And this is actually pulls back into my issues with how we think about a two-party system. Because when we play the game of, well, I don't have to reach that part of the Black population. Well, okay, you don't. But then when you lose by 270, what enclaves does everyone look towards to somehow save democracy? They look towards Cleveland. They look towards Milwaukee. They look towards, of course, the Atlanta, Charlotte. Well, don't even look to Birmingham knowing. So you're looking towards Black enclaves to save democracy. You may want to take it more seriously that you need to reach out to them, which has always been an issue with regard to a two-party system with Black folks. That's what I was kind of getting at.
I'm gonna start with a response to part of what you said, but it ultimately will link up to part of what you said. In 1970, Cynthia Fuchs Epstein Park published a book called Women's Place, which was about, she was doing surveys and interviews with women in professional organizations and studying under what conditions they were able to, in fact, effectively exercise any degree of influence in the positions that they had. I happen to be a sociological social psychologist.
Mhm.
And I picked up on that along with the research tradition that I'm a part of and began testing some of those ideas, including a paper I had published in ASR called Can Gender Inequalities Be Reduced?
Mhm.
And we were testing some of the kinds of ideas that she was
Yeah.
talking about, including things like the more objective the standards are, which show whether you succeed or fail at a task. But more relevantly to what you've been talking about, the degree to which you can appear to be non-confrontational whenever you actually argue for your point.
Mhm.
In that really brought to mind to me, I'm leaving out one little part here, the nature of the theoretical work that I do in relation to my studies treats both race and gender and class and a whole bunch of other things
Mhm.
as what we call diffuse status characteristics
Mhm.
that have broad implications to a broad
Yeah.
different situations. And so race and gender both fit into that
Mhm.
category, race, gender, and sex, because they're not the same
Mhm.
thing.
Mhm.
So that the results that I got, which confirmed that these things do work,
Yeah.
they don't put you in a position to be above me easily,
Mhm.
or you in a position to be above me easily because I'm a white male. But it does compensate considerably for
Mhm.
those circumstances. What brought it to mind to me was the debate
Mhm.
where when Trump comes out with his Haitians are eating cats.
Yeah.
I can't say that without just, it's horrible, but I can't
Yeah.
say it without laughing at the whole concept of it. But looking at the way in which Harris responded to it,
Mhm.
not getting indignant or angry,
Yeah. Yeah.
but following the kinds of strategies that Epstein was arguing for. By the way, she wasn't suggesting that people were consciously doing these things all the time. It's just what they learned how to do.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And that's what Harris clearly had learned how to do.
Mhm.
Is she looked like she was the bemused mother looking down.
Mhm.
Oh, is that really true, Timmy?
Yeah.
Kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure how much effect it had on the overall electorate,
Mhm.
but it told me, boy, she's using the best strategy she could possibly
Yes.
use under
Yeah.
these unfortunate circumstances
Yeah.
to try to get that across. And it would work whether it was female or black or Asian or all of those things together.
And that's what the political science literature that I do a lot of work with, looking at these campaign strategies of women and men candidates. You hear all the time when women run, they win at similar rates as men. And that's true, but it hides all of the extra work they have to do that you were
Yes.
describing of how to respond in a certain way.
And it's
Or
partly
how
because
not
of that
to
double
respond.
standard.
And like you were saying, I doubt usually debates matter a little bit and that lasts for a while. So I don't think we will see a huge electoral impact, as you were saying, from her keeping a straight face or a mostly straight face during the debate. But if she hadn't done so, if she hadn't put in this
yeah.
work, then we would see
Then
the
it's,
difference.
she's down the tubes.
Exactly, yeah. But yeah, that's all really helpful in thinking about it.
I think we've spent some very good minutes today.
Yeah,
Oh,
Thank you so much.
Enjoyed it.
Yeah, it's fun.
thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Nice presentation, both of you.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Enjoyed it. Thank you all for coming.
Both of our guests have been participants in the Rockefeller College. The dean did not tell me to do this. So. Although, Rockefeller College election series of Zooms at noon. The next two Zoom presentations will be on October the 23rd, entitled Civil Disobedience, a discussion on activism and rights and implications. And on the 28th, how AI shapes government policies and politics. Google the Rockefeller College website for more information and registration details. And Justin still got one more of these.
Yeah.
For the election.
Yeah. Oh, not on this one. The one that I'll be doing is on youth voting, and it'll be actually after the election, November 19th.
Or there.
Yeah. Oh, that's gonna be fun, actually. It's gonna be real fun.
Actually, the two of you should contact the Honors College director.
Mhm.
I think the Honors College students would be really interested in your topic.
Oh, I'm talking to them on Friday.
Oh, are you good?
Great.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
She's already ahead.
That's good. No, that's
When
good.
do you sleep?
Yeah.
Not a lot.
What
I
a
have,
busy semester.
yeah, I have a 4-year-old and a 1-year-old, so not at all. Enough coffee, I'm good.
Our next conversation will be in 2 weeks and we'll be with Rex Smith, a longtime editor and columnist at the Times Union, who now writes a Substack entitled Upstate American. That's a great read. He touches current trends and issues through his witty musings and always with a well-traveled but upstate New York perspective. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you for inviting us. This is a great conversation. Thank you all.
I got a book for you.
Oh.
1960s.
Let me shut down the
Oh,
recording.
Yes.
Because it's about Washington, it's about a either Finnish or Swedish anthropologist who went to in Washington DC.
We're gonna record the conversation.
Oh.
Yeah, hold on.
Very basic.
I mean,
research about the underlying theory behind all.
Oh,
of
that's
it.
got.
Those are mine.
But I'm
I got a piece of paper
directly
right here.
involved with.
Oh, yeah, because all my stuff's up.
Thank you, sir.
Biggest characteristics,
The name of the
double
book
standard. I can
is
give you maybe 100 articles.
Soul
on something that
Side.
would be directly related to what you would.
Soul Side.
Because you're doing more what, this is
And
not a negative,
author
work, more applied work. You're taking the theoretical principles
is
and applying them to immediate situations.